So, good evening, everybody. A warm welcome from all of us at Institusen over here. We have Dr. Jacob Schmidt-Madsen with us on our Institusen platform today. Hello, Dr. Jacob. Uh, Dr. Jacob Schmidt-Madsen is a postdoctoral researcher and acting director of the Center for the Study of Indian Science at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. He works within the field of historical game studies with special emphasis on traditional South Asian board games. He has written extensively on the games of chaupar, commonly known as Ludo, and gyan chaupar. We know it as by the name of Snakes and Ladders, and is currently preparing a book on the history of games in South Asia. So over to you, Dr. Jacob.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for having me here at the Institution offices in Mumbai. So I'm very excited for this opportunity to be able to share some of my findings exactly on the game of gyan chaupar or snakes and ladders. So let me share my screen and let's get going. Right. So today I'm going to be talking about snakes, ladders, and the subtle body. That is the possible origins of snakes and ladders charts in subtle body grids. So as many of you, if not all of you, probably know, the ludic heritage of South Asia is rich and varied. It covers thousands of years and hundreds of games. And several of those games are still known to us today. So games like chess and games like Ludo and snakes and ladders, they're all originally Indian games. And today we mostly think of them as purely abstract games and often also as children's game, though that is largely because we have really forgotten the interpretations that was once associated with them. When we go back in time, we find that they were often considered as models or simulations. So for example, if we take the game of chess, which we still today associate with war, but not in the sense really of a simulation as was done in the past in South Asia. For example, here, as you can see, the earliest quote known in the Sanskrit literature mentioning the game of chess from Banabhatta's Harsha-charita from the early 7th century, where we read that during the reign of King Harsha, the arrangement of the four-limbed army only takes place on game boards, and battles between kings are only fought between clay figurines. So here clearly this corresponds between the game of chess and actual warfare, which we also find in much more developed sense later on in the chess literature in South Asia. Similarly, a game like Ludo is today mostly associated with children, perhaps, but again, if we go back in time, we find that it was also actually associated with the cosmos. It was used as a metaphor for the cosmos and for human existence in the cosmos, especially by the Bhakti or devotional poets in the early modern period in South Asia. So both of those games have long and interesting histories that I'll not be talking about today. Rather, I'll be focusing on the game of snakes and ladders, or gyan chaupar as it's called, the Indian predecessor is called. So a brief overview. First, I'll say a little bit about the origins and history of snakes and ladders. Then I'll go a little more into depth and try to analyze these early gyan chaupar boards. That is really the predecessor of snakes and ladders. And then I'll discuss some of the possible links that I see between these early gyan chaupar boards and charts of the subtle body as they come down to us from the same period. And then finally, I'm going to say a few questions about the living traditions today of playing gyan chaupar. And then we can have some questions. So I know that all of you probably know the game of snakes and ladders, especially people who are tuning in from India or from the UK, where it's a really popular children's game. But still, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm just going to explain the rules here. So this is the game board. Players will start with their single piece down in the bottom left corner, on this board at least, and then they'll move in a certain type fashion up the board until the finishing square, which is here at the top right corner. And once they land on the finishing square, they win the game. The first one to do that wins the game. If during the course of their travels, they land at the foot of a ladder, they'll immediately climb up to the top of that ladder. And conversely, if they land at the head of a snake, they'll immediately slide down to the bottom tail of that snake. And so whoever reaches the finishing square first is the winner of the game. So a very simple game, completely based on the luck of the die. There's absolutely no strategy except if you're able to manipulate the die in a sense so it always lands on a specific number that you require. But apart from that, it's purely a luck-driven game. So Snakes and Ladders really first appears in the historical record in the late 19th century in the UK, where we find these game boards, which are sort of moralistic in nature, and they're aimed at children, teaching them basically how to behave in life. So the Snakes and Ladders will be associated with various virtues and vices. So for example, here, if we zoom in a little bit, we see on the left how the vice of vanity will lead to a fall in status. So, you know, the lady of the house is suddenly becoming the housekeeper. Or conversely, if you take a pity on the poor and destitute in society, that is considered one of the virtues which will uplift you in your life and in society. And again, on the right, if you act cruelly towards other people, well, that cruelty will come back, and here on the picture, quite literally nip you in the butt later on. Now, games about virtues and vices was not a new thing when Snakes and Ladders came around in the late 19th century. It is often said that, that Snakes and Ladders adopted this idea of snakes and vices from the Indian game of gyan, chaupar, but that's actually not so. If we go further back in the historical record, we're talking about Britain now, we find many other games that concerns virtues and vices. And here, for example, the eponymously named Vice Rewarded, or Virtue Rewarded and Vice Punished from 1818. Now, this is a spiral game where you move from the outside towards the center, and you land on specific squares that again are associated with virtues and vices, as you see here, hope and contention, each on each side of virtue, which then is the winning square of this game. And as we can see on the right, under contention, where the rule says if you land there, you must defeat one counter to each player and turn again, really tell us that these games have their origin not really in games about virtues and vices, but in much simpler gambling games. But that's a complete another story that I'll not discuss here. So the takeaway is that when Snakes and Ladders comes about in the late 19th century, the real novelty is the snakes and ladders. And what they do is that they are used as a visual connector between squares. Whereas in the older game, you would need to look up in the rule book or some pamphlet where you would have to read what happens when I land on this space. Now, the Snakes and Ladders completely takes care of that. It removes the need for literacy in order to be able to play the games. You simply just slide up the ladder or slide down the snake, and that's all. So it's a very ingenious game mechanic and makes the game very suitable for children and people who haven't learned to read. So what was adopted in the late 19th century into the Snakes and Ladders board game was not the idea of a game of virtue and vices. Rather, it was the Snakes and Ladders that were lifted directly from the Indian board of the Indian game of gyan, chaupar. So gyan, chaupar is also a game to some extent about virtues and vices, but it's also a game about a whole lot more, as we shall see here during the talk. So looking at gyan, chaupar, how do we describe this game? Well, one way of describing it that I have adopted is to look at it as an interpreted formal system. So an interpreted formal system means a formal system that consists of a matrix of positions, in this case, squares. And on these positions, they can be inhabited by tokens that can also be manipulated between the positions, as in pawns being placed on a game board and moved around the game board. So that's basically your formal system, tokens being manipulated on some kind of matrix of positions. Now, when you then take these different positions, take these different tokens, and take the operations that you make with the token, and you add some kind of meaning to them, some descriptors that interpret them, that's when you start having this interpreted formal system, which can then go from being a completely abstract system into an apt system that is really full of meaning. And the late American philosopher John Hawkland, who introduced the idea of interpreted formal systems, did so in order to describe how artificial intelligence works in computers. But here I'm going to apply to something much more simpler, which is the game of snakes and ladders, to find out what does that game really mean. So if we look at the formal system of gyan chaupar, we find that it consists, we find that it's very closely related to snakes and ladders, as we just looked at before. You know, it consists of this series of linked positions that move in a serpentine fashion from the bottom to the top. And each player is giving a single token or a pawn that it moves along those positions in a unidirectional way. And the movement of these pawns are generated or are determined by the use of binary dice, very often cories. Those gray shapes that I drew here was an attempt at making something look like a cory shell that you can throw, and it can land either face up or face down, so giving you a binary result. And this game of gyan chaupar is often played with 7 cory shells, allowing for throws between 0 and 7 when you throw the dice. And as you move your pawns along the track, well, we also have these links that connect forwards and backwards. They don't really change the fact that this is a purely luck-driven game, but they do introduce a sense of tension and drama into the game. There's something dramatic about landing on a space when you've almost reached the winning square and then sliding way back down the game board again, even though if you had no control over it because it was completely determined by the dice. One of the ways in which gyan chaupar varies from the snakes and ladders formal system is that the placement of the winning square is not at the end of the track, but rather in the top central square of the track, which means that you can overshoot the winning position, forcing you to go back down the board and around again and try to hit it again. But that's basically sort of the only difference in the formal system. The much bigger difference has to do with how this formal system is interpreted. As we saw in the British games, the snakes and ladders game, the modern games, it was interpreted as a game of virtues and vices. But when we look at how the formal system in gyan chaupar is interpreted, we find that it's actually a descriptor of the journey of souls, the karmic journey of souls through existence towards liberation. So all these serially linked positions are now spiritual stages on a journey. The tokens that you manipulate, that is your pawns, they are the souls that move through these spiritual stages. And the links that propel them up and karmic fruitions. So they are and the dice that drive you forward are not simply cory shells. There are representatives of your karmic fate that'll drive you forward. And the winning square is not just a square where you land and then you win the game. No, it's the square of liberation, where you sort of leave material reality behind and are liberated from all these chains of existence. So this also shows that if you overshoot the winning square, the square of liberation, you will slide down the game board and you will make sort of a cyclical motion that will be reminiscent of the idea of the cycle of rebirth that all souls have to go through on their way to liberation. So now, if we look at this system, we can see that this is clearly not what was adopted by snakes and ladders in the late 19th century. So where did the British game manufacturers get this idea from to adopt the snakes and ladders? Well, they probably did that from the lithographs that were mass produced in the late 19th century in India. We find them in several places. And here you can see the snakes and ladders are clearly there. And then in the background, you have all this religious terminology that was just forgotten about by the manufacturers in the West, because they saw an interesting game mechanic that they could apply to their own sort of Victorian moralistic universe, and then forget about all these religious connotations found in the Indian versions. However, before these lithographs, the game had already existed for 100 years or more in hand-painted charts. And these hand-painted charts are found in different religious communities, such as the Sufi communities, the Jaina communities, the Vaishnava communities, and we even have some games that are related to Advaita Vedanta philosophy. So here, the game is at its core the same. What changes between these versions is the layout of the board and the inscriptions on the board. So if you're reading a Sufi board as opposed to a Vaishnava board, you will of course use different religious terminology to indicate the positive and negative qualities of the universe and the different spiritual stages that you go through. But other than that, the formal system is the same. What differs is really the interpretation of the formal system. The majority of these charts that have survived to us to today come from Western India, most from Rajasthan, and if we want to be very specific, the majority of game boards, or the highest concentration of game boards, I should say, is found in and around Jaipur in Rajasthan. And most of these game boards, they come from the Vaishnava and the Jaina communities. The other boards related to other communities are not as frequent at all. So the boards go back to, well, at least the late 18th century. That's where we find the earliest evidence of the game. That is here on your left, you will see the earliest known Vaishnava board, and on your right, you will see the earliest known Jaina board, both of them from the 1780s. And this might be controversial, but in my view, the game is really not much older than this. The ideas behind the game are certainly older, but the game itself, I don't believe to be much older, perhaps 100 years older, but not more than that. And I base this upon the lack of references to the game, the lack of visual references, the lack of textual references, even where we might expect to find them, such as, for example, in the Bhakti poetry, as we saw on the early slide with Ludo, where we saw Mirabai's verse describing a chaupar game as a metaphor for reality and for existence in the world. Well, it would be much more obvious to use gyan chaupar as a metaphor for the universe if that game was known at the time. But the Bhakti poets, they only use chaupar to refer to it. And I think that in the late 19th century, Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, who established the Ramakrishna mission, he is actually the first one to make use of a kind of gyan chaupar game as a metaphor for human existence when he refers to his disciples playing the game of Golokhan, which is a Bengali variant of the game. But that's the late 19th century. So the game was probably invented, in my view, in the late 17th or during the 18th century. And I believe that the earliest type of board was the Vaishnava boards that you see here on your left. I can't go into all the reasons for why I think that, but that's my interpretation of the material. So for the rest of this talk, I'll be focusing on the Vaishnava charts in particular, and I'll be focusing on a critical edition of these Vaishnava charts. And by critical edition, I mean an edition that is the result of correlating dozens and dozens of these charts and comparing the readings on them and the placement of the snakes and ladders to arrive at some kind of standard game that we can use when we try to interpret the meaning of the game. And that standard looks like this. It consists of 72 squares, and the squares are all sequentially numbered and inscribed, as you see here on the screen. Now, all these inscriptions, they can largely fit into three categories. One of them has to do with the mapping of the universe. The other has to do with human existence within that universe. And the third has to do really with the becoming and the unbecoming of the universe. So if we begin here with the category of describing the universe, we see that the board is ordered according to the central column. This is where we find the Saptalokas, the seven worlds that constitute the universe, all the way from Bhulok, or the earth at the bottom, to Satyaloka, the world of truth, in square 59, and then above that Vaikuntha, the heaven of Vishnu. And this is a very standard way of doing it. You have the 7 worlds, and on top of the 7th world, you have the heaven of your chosen deity, in this case, Vishnu. And then we have some other cosmographical inscriptions scattered around other parts of the world. So here we can say that each row belongs to a different sphere of the universe. And living within that universe are the humans, the souls that are traveling through the universe in the form of pawns in this game. And therefore, we have all these squares that are associated with positive and negative qualities of existence and positive and negative states of existence. So qualities and states mostly. And on the right side of the board, we'll find these dualisms like subudhi, durbuddhi, intelligence and foolishness, and kusang and susang, bad company and good company. So these the dualisms of life. Whereas on the left side, we have kamyo, gyan, and bhakti, which are the 3 marks, the 3 paths that leads to liberation. Kam, the path of action; gyan, the path of knowledge; and bhakti, the path of devotion. So beyond the universe and the qualities that exist within the universe, we also have basically the becoming of the universe. And that becoming is ordered according to the Sankhya system of philosophy, which is a system of philosophy that enumerates all the principles that exist in the universe and from which everything is created, basically. And there in the top left corner, we have the 3 qualities that is inherent in all matter: Tamogun, Rajagun, and Satogun. So the quality of darkness or inertia, the quality of light or activity, and the quality of truth, Satogun. And in the top right, we have Prakriti, which is the primordial matter from which everything evolves. So in the Sankhya system of philosophy, we usually have 25 tattvas or principle. And the first tattva, that is that of Purusha, which denotes consciousness. And Purusha is not part of the board because the board here is a representation of material reality, and consciousness is separate from that. And we can say it is instantiated on the board by the pawns, which represents individual souls, which also are individual instantiations of consciousness. But from Prakriti, everything else evolves. And if we go further down the board, we will see here those gray squares of the 50s: Jal, water; Akash, ether; Vayu, wind; Tej, fire; Prithvi, earth. The 5 Mahabhutas are gross elements of the universe. And further down, we have 4 of the 5 Tanmatras, or subtle elements: Shak, sound; Ras, taste; Gandh, smell; and Spas, touch. We only miss Rupa, form. And that we miss Rupa form is not a problem, because this is not trying to be an exhaustive description of the Sankhya system. It is, and it merely shows parts of the system which are then representative of the whole of the system, is the idea. Now, having looked at all these different squares, we still have Agni and Durati hanging a little bit, but I'll return to those later, because I believe that they are really something that points at the subtle body charge, which I feel are connected to these gyan chaupar charts. So I'll return to them a little later. And then, of course, the grid is overlaid with the snakes and the ladders connecting the different squares. So, you know, positive actions are associated with positive states and negative actions with negative states. So, for example, in square 63, we have tamas, or ignorance, which leads down to square number 3, krodh, or anger. Whereas in square 54, we have bhakti, or devotion, which leads up to square 68, Vaikunth, or the heaven of Vishnu, which is also the winning square of the game. So here, bhakti and the ladder leading from bhakti directly to Vaikunth, the winning square, clearly indicates that this chart is oriented towards Vaishnava bhakti. So when we look at the game like this, we now have like a complete description of the universe. What we're looking at here is the totality of phenomenal reality. But we're looking at it as a static map, as a static image. So what I want to do is to go beyond that and say, well, what actually happens when we activate the static image? What happens when we start to play around with it like a game? Because, you know, just as books have to be read in order to be analyzed. Games also have to be played in order to be analyzed. So if we only look at it as a static map, well, it'll tell us one thing. When we activate it as a game, it'll tell us another. Now, the problem about activating it as a game is that we don't actually know how these games were used in the past. We pretty much know how they were played mechanically, but we don't really know how they were engaged with beyond that. We have indications that they were used for education, they were used for entertainment, they were used for divination, they were used for self-exploration, they were played on certain occasions, religious occasions during festivities to generate merit just by playing them. But again, we don't really know the details of this. But the way I want to approach it here is in sort of the divinatory, self-exploratory mode, which I believe to be one of the earliest, if not the earliest mode in which the game boards were used. So when we activate them in this mode, we find the first thing that happens is that you take your pawn, which is representative of your jeev or your soul, your individual soul, and you place it in square one, janma, or birth. So you're now born into the universe, and immediately you stop looking at the totality of the board, but you zoom in and look at just the one square, birth. This is where you are now. You forget about everything else. You're just here. You've just been born into the universe. And you know that the throw of dice can only carry you so far. So you don't look at all the other squares on the board. You're much more likely to look at the squares just in front of you, like, where can I end up on this next throw of the dice? And then you take your cowrie shells and you throw them. And doing that is, again, at submission to the divine fate. You're not just throwing them to try to get ahead as fast as possible. You're throwing them to see how is your own karma reflected in this game. So the idea is that the throw of the cowries, the way they land, the number they give you is a reflection of your own karma. You're no longer in control. This game is now telling you something about yourself as you play it. So say, for example, you started out rolling a 5. So you go from janma to mo, bewilderment or delusion. So you've been born into this world, and naturally, like most of us, when we first encounter this world, we're pretty bewildered. So it makes sense that we're here in square number 6. You roll the dice again, come up to square number 10, tap, austerity, discipline. You found a method or a way in life, a way to engage life, a way to move through life and discipline yourself and set clear aims for yourself. And therefore, naturally, there is a ladder that propels you directly into Swarglok or heaven. So already things are going pretty good. You're in heaven and you're only 3 throws into the game. So you throw the dice again, but perhaps you become a little too sure of yourself. And unfortunately, you throw a 6 and you end in adharm or irreligiosity. So perhaps you forgot some of your duties in life. Perhaps you forgot the path that you're really following. You were too full of your own early success, and you slide right down back into square number 6, the place of bewilderment where you were just before. And you're none the wiser. You're just back where you were right before. So you throw the die again, and you hope that you can regain that method in square 10, but unfortunately, you only saw 3. So you end up in calm or passion, in the throes of desire. And on your next throw, these are the possibilities ahead of you. If you throw a 1, well, you regain that discipline and you can climb back up to Swarglok. But there are also 2 snakes here that can bite you and take you down to the first plane of existence again. They can land in one of the other squares and just, slowly continue on your journey through life. So what we're seeing here, and also, of course, the way that I'm telling it, is that by playing the game in this way, you create a spiritual narrative for yourself. You don't list all the squares. No, you only focus on the squares that you land on. So here the journey is janma mo tat swag adham mo kam. And this becomes your list of squares, which becomes your own spiritual biography. And you also notice patterns, such as the thing that the game that we just played a little bit of here, the pawn visited Mo twice. So there's this tendency for this pawn to end up in Mo and bewilderment. So you can think again, then, is there something I need to work on here? Do I often lose my path? Do I have difficulties in keeping my focus? Is that why I constantly end up in Mo? So already here you see the potential for the game to reflect your own life, but also to start working on your problems, or perhaps rather having you start working on your own problems by feeding you some information that you can interpret on. So in this sense, the game board stops becoming a map of human existence. Rather, when you play it, it becomes your own route through human existence. And this basically, in a nutshell, is the power of games. And I think this is perhaps of anything, the most important takeaway from this lecture is that this is the power of games. This ability to use a simple model or a simple system to model key characteristics of a larger and much more complex system, and allow us to not just look at the system and how it's put together, but really to experience the system from the inside out. That's the power of games. And that's very much what's at play right here in Gyan Chaupar as we look at it. Now, the charts themselves, they are mostly silent about how this game should be engaged with. However, on some charts, we do find verses and small passages of text written around the charts that give us some clue as to how the charts understand themselves. So, for example, the most widely attested verse is found on Jaina charts. It's found throughout most of the known Jaina charts. And it's the verse that you see here. I just have to move something on my screen so I can actually read it out. Good. So it says, with great effort, one is freed from falling down the 9 great energy channels and roaming the 84 lakh birth situations. What is the chaupar of Kshatrunjaya? It is the game of the nameless Brahman. If one plays this game, one extinguishes one's anger and does not roam around existence. One is joyful at heart. The game of knowledge reduces sin, tears apart delusion, and increases knowledge. So here we can see how the snakes are identified with these 9 great energy channels. There are 9 snakes, or 9 great energy channels called nadis. And the squares are identified with the 84 lakh birth situations. So really there are 84 times 100,000 birth situations, and each square of the Jaina board, which has 84 squares, is then representative of 1 lakh or 1 times 100,000 birth situations. So clearly we have some idea of how this chart is interpreting itself as both the energy channels, which I'll return to and explain in more detail, and then the birth situations. Now, something similar is going on the Vaishnava charts. And here, for example, we have a verse that reads, there are 9 energy channels, again, nadis, and 72 squares or bodily cavities, kotas, on the board of knowledge. So here again, we find the snakes are associated with nadis or energy channels, but the squares here on the Vaishnava board are not associated with yonis or birth situations, but rather with these kotas, these bodily cavities. And I'll return to them in a minute as well. Let me just give you one more example from another Vaishnava chart, which reads, the game is called the pastime of knowledge, gyan vilas. One should play it with attention. It has 9 energy channels, nadi, and 72 squares or bodily cavities, kota. In it, everything is laid out. Now, these terms, nadi and kota, they're especially associated with tantric and yogic descriptions of the subtle body, as we find it, for example, in the Nat yogic literature in Western India. So if we look at some contemporary examples from the 18th century, we find the following descriptions in the literature, descriptions of the subtle body, I should underline. So one verse here from the Gorakhbhani attributed to Gorakhnath, the founder of the Nat yogic sampradaya or tradition, saying that there are 9 veins or nadis and 72 rooms or kotas in the subtle body, just as we saw before on the game charts. And here, another example from the Siddha Siddhanta Paddhati, also attributed to Gorakhnath and dated to the 18th century, says that there are 27 asterisms, 12 houses of zodiac, 9 planets, 9 lakh stars, 15 tittis, dwell in their own 72,000 internal cavities, koshas, which is named as kotas, of the interwoven nadis in the body. So again, here we see that the koshas or kotas, they contain all these cosmological principles, the asterisms, the houses of the zodiac, the planets, all this, basically the whole universe is mapped onto the subtle bodies and contained within it in these different kotas, which are then these bodily compartments in the subtle body. So we clearly have here an identification between the gyan chaupar boards and this not yogic ideas of the subtle body. And just to add one more thing to the plate here, I also mentioned that we have on 3 Jaina charts, we find a verse from Kabir, the famous Sant Bhakti poet, which reads, "He who walks between boundaries is a man. He who goes beyond them is a saint. But he who transcends the limited and the limitless, his greatness is unfathomable." So here, beyond having this connection to the tantric and yogic traditions, we also have this connection to the Sant tradition of northwestern India. And it's clear that these charts were aware of those traditions, of the tantric traditions, of the yogic traditions, of the Sant traditions. They were aware of them, and perhaps, just perhaps, they even to some extent evolved from them, or were at least inspired from them in the way that the game boards were designed. So if we now return to our game board again, before we looked at it as a macrocosmic representation of the universe, but now with this added knowledge that we just gleaned from looking at these verses written on the game charts and correlating it with the not yogic texts, we can start seeing it not just as a representation of the macrocosmos, but also as a representation of the microcosmos, that is the mapping of universal principles onto the individual body. So the squares, we were told, are kotas. Now, kotas in the medical literature are the compartments in the body in which the viscera lie. So all your intestines, all your inner organs will lie in different kotas. That's how it's described in the medical literature. And that terminology is then also used in the subtle body descriptions, where the kotas then become the enclosures where these divine principles are located within the subtle body. And in the central column, we saw that we have the saptalokas, the 7 lokas, or the 7 worlds or planes of existence, with Vaikuntha at the top. Now, in subtle body terminology, these lokas, they stand for the chakras. So mapping the lokas onto the subtle body is really mapping the chakras onto the subtle body. So you have the 7 chakras with mukti, or liberation, at the top of the 7th chakra. Furthermore, we saw that the nadis, the snakes were equated with the nadis, which are the energy channels. And the energy channels are imagined as these channels that basically control the flow of energy throughout your body. And they're usually said to be 72,000. So here again, the 72 squares on the board is then representative of the 72,000 nadis. And as we saw before, they're also said to be 72,000 kotas. So again, the numbers match up here with the symbology. And though it's only the snakes that are correlated with the nadis, the ladder should probably also be taken as nadis. And I say that because the imagery of the ladders, we don't really know where it originates with regard to these boards. But we do have boards, like for example, in Nepal, where there are no ladders. They're actually only snakes. But it doesn't mean that every time you land on a snake, you slide down, because there are malign snakes that will take you down, but there are also benign snakes that will pull you up. So where does this ladder imagery come from? We don't know. There are references again in the not yogic literature talking about the mukti supana, the ladder to liberation. It may also be influenced from the Sufi communities. We don't know. It would be great to be able to answer this question in more detail, but I don't know right now. But the idea anyway is that the snakes and the ladders, we can consider them as nadis, energy channels running throughout the subtle body. And this also makes sense. If you can see the squares are highlighted in blue. Before it said Ganga, Yamuna, Sarasvati, the 3 sacred rivers, which in a macrocosmic interpretation can be used to describe, are described as cosmographical features, but in the subtle body terminology, they correspond to Ida, Pingala, and Sushumna, which are the 3 main nadis in the subtle body. Furthermore, the way you move up the board is in this serpentine fashion. And when we're looking at the subtle body and we're looking at chakras, well, what is missing is really the Kundalini Shakti, the Kundalini power, which is often visualized as a coiled serpent. And it's usually described as having 3 or 3.5 coils, but we do actually have several examples in the Hatha Yogic literature where it's described as having 8 coils, which could then correspond to the 8 rows of the game board. So suddenly playing this game is no longer just a karmic journey through existence towards liberation. It is also a raising of the Kundalini power within the subtle body, unlocking the different chakras and leading to transcendence and transformation and ultimately liberation in mukti at the top of the board. So in that sense, we have this double entendre. We have a map of the cosmos, we have a map of the subtle body, and they are coeval and existing within the same game board. Now, if we look at traditional drawings of the subtle body, they can, for example, look something like this. They're usually figurative in nature, and they may also have illustrations and inscriptions mapped onto them. And we find something similar in the Jaina Gyan chaupar game boards. Here we have often the game board grid inserted into the torso of a body. And this body can either be the Loka Purusha, that is the cosmic man, which encapsulates the entire universe, but it can also be a person standing. If you look at the arms, they're sort of hanging down the sides and the hands are turned out a little bit. This is the usual position of the Kayutsaka, the abandonment of the body, which is a meditative pose used in Jainism. So the body imagery here is again the cosmic man encapsulating the universe, and also the individual Jaina practitioner standing in this mode of intense concentration and yogic meditation, so to speak. So if we then look at some of these subtle body charts that have come down to us, we see here a correspondence between these two charts. But what I really want to focus on is something that's even more interesting with these subtle body charts, because in late 18th century Bengal, there appears suddenly a couple of subtle body charts which are very interesting. But let me just read out a small passage here from an article from 1849 by Babu Bipin Bihari Som called The Physical Errors of Hinduism. It's a very polemical article, so don't get too upset about the title. It's meant to be polemical. The late Baba Ganga Govinda Singha, a wealthy native residing in a village near Murshidabad in West Bengal today, spent the greater part of his fortune in making researches into the Hindu Shastras. Not satisfied with the pandits of his own village, he came to reside in Nadia, the famous seat of Sanskrit learning in Bengal. He invited several pandits from the upper provinces, that is UP, the original seat of Hinduism. It was by a set of these pandits known by the name of Daudus, which I take to be followers of the poet saint Dadu Dayal, that the originals of these two maps, that is the subtle body charts, were drawn according to the principles of the Tantras expressly for the use of the employer. Now, one of these maps you see here on the screen, it's a reproduction of the original map. The original map's unfortunately been lost, but this reproduction is given in this article from 1849. You can see this is sort of a standard representation of the subtle body with the bodily outline. You can see the chakras, you can see the nadis connecting the different chakras. But there's also another chart which looks like this. And this here is a subtle body chart where we suddenly have the subtle body represented like a grid, similar to the ones that we find in Gyan chaupar. And if we look a little bit closer at it or enlarge it a little bit, we can see that it's made up of a grid of squares. And in this grid of squares, we do also find some illustrations or symbols. We find the different symbols corresponding to the chakras in the central spine. And we also find some imagery corresponding to cosmography, just as Kurma, the turtle at the bottom, and then the serpent above the turtle, the turtle, and so on. And interestingly, we also find snakes connecting squares. Again, not ladders. The ladder imagery is not here, but we find snakes connecting ladders. As we saw, snakes can be equated with the nadis. So the board here is only numbered because it's a reproduction. So here the numbers really maps onto a list of references in the article, which tells you what is inscribed in the different squares of the board. So to help you understand it better, I just did a graphical representation of the board where you can actually read what's written in the squares of the original chart. And here we immediately see the further correspondences with gyan chaupar. If we look at just the main body of the chart, not considering the head and the arms, we have 72 squares, an 8x9 grid. A couple of squares in the center of the board have been subdivided, but all in all, we have an 8x9 grid, just like gyan chaupar. We also see that the chart is controlled, or is structured, is what I was looking for, is structured along the central column where we have the chakras mapped onto them. We have the chakras mapped onto the squares with the central column, similar to the lokas or the chakras in the gyan chaupar boards. We also have these dualisms, these opposites relating to, again, human existence, as we saw when we first analyzed the gyan chaupar boards. We even have the same terminology. So we have, for example, on the left, dharma and adharma, and on the right, we have bhakti and tamas, and the hands are even associated with punyapala and papapala. So punyapala, the fruits of vices, and papapala, the fruits of, the other way around. Punyapala, the fruits of virtue, and papapala, the fruits of vices. And those squares here, the duality squares, they are connected by snakes. So the snakes here are connecting negatives and positives, which is different from gyan chaupar, but we still have the same idea of the snakes as connectors between different qualities in the universe. And finally, we have these different groupings of terms that represent principles underlying the universe. And several of those are really the same as the ones that we also find on our gyan chaupar charts. So for example, sattva, rajas, tamas, and the top left, the three gunas, the three qualities inherent in all matter. And at the bottom, in the same columns, tejas, ab, vayu, fire, water, wind, which are three of the five mahabhutas, or gross elements of the world. We also have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, like we have the Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva lok on the gyan chaupar boards. We also have in the top right, Salokya, Samikya, Sarukya, Sayudhya, these four steps towards liberation, which are actually found directly on certain Maharashtrian gyan chaupar boards. So we see this very close correspondence here between the way that this subtle body chart is structured and the way that the gyan chaupar charts are structured. So we don't know how this chart was used. I mean, it's a map of the subtle body, but from everything we know about tantric practices, it's very likely that this chart was used to something that went beyond merely illustrating the subtle body, but rather something that was also used to visualize and to meditate upon. So if this is true, that it was used for these purposes, then we might start thinking that if subtle body charts, they encourage some kind of non-formalized ludic interaction in terms of, for example, visualizing the raising of the Kundalini power through the chakras towards liberation, could gyan chaupar, the game, then really be a formalization of these non-formalized ludic interactive systems, so that gyan chaupar somehow comes to stand at the crossroads of a spiritual practice and a spiritual pastime, and also something that can help us understand the inherent playful nature of tantric practice using these tantric subtle body charts. So these are questions that I don't have answers for, and I very much like to know these answers, of course, but as I said, we don't know how the subtle body charts were engaged with in any detail, and we don't know either how the gyan chaupar charts were engage with in any detail. But what we can do is that we can look at existing traditions of how gyan chaupar charts are used and see if we can find some kind of linkage back to this idea of meditation, visualization, and self-exploration associated with these early tantric subtle body diagrams. And in India, the two main living traditions of using gyan chaupar that I've encountered are a didactic tradition and a more ritualistic tradition. So the didactic tradition I have found, especially in Western Indian Jaina communities, where the game is often used as a didactic tool to teach Jaina children about their religion, about their philosophy, teach them religious terminology and the layout of the universe and ideas about karma and progress and the importance of disciplines and following scripture and these kind of things. So a didactic tool mostly aimed at children. The other part is mostly encountered in South India, where you have these very colorful illustrated charts. Sometimes they have inscriptions on them, but often they're just illustrations. And these are especially prevalent and especially played around religious festivals, especially Shivratri and Vaikunth Ekadashi, festivals where you stay up throughout the night and play this game for practical purposes of staying awake, but also to generate a merit by engaging with this game, which is again symbolic of overcoming difficulties in life and attaining enlightenment or release from human existence. So none of those really correspond to this divinatory, self-exploratory mode that I was talking about before. But in the 1970s, Harish Johari, he introduced the game to the Western world, especially to the New Age communities in the 70s. And he did so by producing a game board and a book which gave detailed descriptions of each of the squares. Whenever you landed on the square, you could read in this book and understand something about what does this square mean and how can I use that to sort of analyze myself as I play the game. Harish Johari also says that this was really a standard, that game boards used to come with a little booklet of shlokas or verses that you would read every time you landed on a square to give an idea of what does that square actually represent. Now, none of those books, if they ever existed, have come down to us. But Harish Johari, anyway, how entrenched that tradition was, we don't know, but he at least continues whatever was of that tradition by writing this book and presenting the game as a tool for self-exploration. And this was very well received in the New Age communities, and the book has been reprinted several times, it's been translated into multiple languages. Just a couple of months ago, I wrote an introduction for the new Latvian translation, or was it Estonian? I can't even remember, but one of the Baltic countries. So this is still a book that is still very much alive, and it's especially prevalent these days in Russian-speaking communities. In the Russian-speaking communities, we find that Harish Johari's book has been adopted and also been transformed into something of a business model, where you now can take courses in becoming a gyan chaupar instructor, and there are guides that will host seminars and therapy sessions where single persons and multiple persons can join in and play the game and actually use it to explore themselves and questions that they are dealing with in their own minds. And it even goes so far that my own doctoral dissertation on snakes and ladders was recently translated into Russian and is now sold at yoga studio, Nim Yoga Studio in Moscow, which I was of course excited about people practically engaging with my work outside the academic world, but it also shows that the interest in this game is real, and there's an interest to go even beyond the sort of rather popular descriptions of the squares given by Harish Johari and into sort of the nitty-gritty of the terminology and all the footnotes surrounding sort of the deeper meaning of these squares. There's an interest in trying to grapple with that. And instructors in these courses in the Russian-speaking parts of the world, instructors are encouraged to develop their own books of commentary to the game. And in that sense, continuing the tradition of Harish Johari of writing commentary to the individual squares and have basically each instructor write their own Harris to Harry book and have their own unique interpretation of the game and their own unique way of playing it and playing it with other people. And I was lucky enough last summer to have my own first experience of playing the game. I played it via Zoom with a Belarusian instructor. And the game lasted for a full 5 hours. And it was all centered about a question that I posted to the game board before play began. And then for those 5 hours, as I moved around the board, the coach would sort of direct me into tackling this question from different angles and lots of other subjects associated with the question. And it really became a full, prolonged 5-hour therapy session working on whatever issues that was related to the question that I had asked of the board. It was a very powerful experience, and it definitely convinced me that this game is a very effective tool for self-exploration. And it also gave me a glimpse of how this game, just how it might have been experienced by people who played it 200 or 300 years ago. So we, of course, don't know how this game was played in the past. And I'm sure it was played differently than it's played today and differently than I experienced it in this sort of new agey therapeutic setting. But I think that the spirit of playing the games, the way you engage with it, this highly individualized approach to how to interpret the game, that is something that I believe could very well be similar to how the game was approached in the past. So we might say that though gyan chaupar has long since been replaced by snakes and ladders, the living tradition of using it as a tool for self-exploration continues even today in these new age communities. And with that, I will end my talk and start speaking and, well, answer any questions if there are any. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Jacob. It was very interesting presentation. And what I think is almost all the religions have condemned playing with dice. And this is a game played with dice, right? So very interesting that ultimately the religion has to surrender to the game, I must say. Is it true?
Well, I mean, throughout time and eternity, games have been condemned by society because, you know, games can lead to gambling and they can lead to not doing the work that you're supposed to do and so on and so forth. But the other side of the coin is that games are also just inherent. They're part of human nature. So we can't be stopped from playing. So the way to go about it is to create spaces where games are allowed to exist. And on the one hand, we have, like, if we look at the Artha Shastra, for example, the old Indian treatise of statecraft, we find these description of how you should set up gambling houses. So, you know, there is a specific place, people can go there, they can play games, and the house will take a certain percentage of the winnings or the stakes, and that will then become a sort of gaming tax that will go to the king. This is pretty much like casinos today, right? People also travel, you know, into international waters to sit on a boat and play in a casino. And it's accepted because, you know, then we have sort of a way to control the gambling. And similarly, we find that games are often associated with special religious occasions where it's okay to play a game. And in that sense, it's almost carnivalesque in the sense that, you know, here we allow you to play games for this night alone. For example, on Shivratri or Vaikuntha Ekadashi, you can play games tonight. It's okay. You can gamble. You can do what you want. And again, it's a way of letting out that steam. and finding pockets where we say, okay, it's accepted within this context, but it's not accepted generally. You know, we can't have you play all the time, spend all your lunch breaks gambling away your earnings. But we can create these contexts in which it's okay to play, and even to play for money, as we find. So I think that's how we need to look at it. That, you know, it's something that cannot be controlled, so it will find a way.
Very true. Very true. So I think the chat box is open. If at all anybody has any questions, do ask. You can speak on the, unmute yourself and ask questions also. Are there any questions in the chat box?
Yes, ma'am. There's one question.
Yeah, please.
Should I read it?
Yeah, please.
Fabulous talk, doctor. Thanks. Just an observation. In the modern version, there is a strong element of chance, which does not seem taught to be an element in gyan chaupar at all, because rising through the nadis is a serious, deliberate endeavor. This question is asked by Unni Bhaskaran.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, chance is basically just the opposite side of fate. It's the opposite of fate. I mean, chance and fate, they're basically the same thing. I mean, so you can believe that chance is something that is just completely randomly generated by the dice you throw, or you can believe that chance is sort of the divinely ordained fate. So when you play gyan chaupar, and especially, for example, in the way that I tried to play just last summer, it was very clear that when I threw the dice, the idea was that the dice knew what numbers to show. I didn't have any control over it. I just threw, and if I threw a 4, it was because the game intended for me to move 4 spaces and to land in a specific space, and to engage with that space and the inscription on it. That's how you can think of it. And that also, I mean, nullifies the gambling aspect of the game. If the dice you throw are not just random numbers, but they're actually divinely ordained and they are reflective of your own karma in the world, well, then you're sort of past the problem of gambling. You're almost not throwing dice. That's just the gods speaking to you, and move 4 squares ahead and think about where you are now. I think that's how we should understand it. And then again, of course, you can also play it in a, you can play it as a pastime, where you don't consider, or you're not concerned at all with interpretations and with getting any message from the board or with fate or anything. All I basically talked about in this talk you can ignore, and you can just play the game as an abstract entertainment game. And I talked to people who play this game also as a gambling game, privately in India. So, you know, you can use it in whatever mode you want. But what I was trying to describe today is a specific mode of playing the game that I find is connected somehow to these early tantric practices, which to me are also ludic in effect. I mean, if you're sitting looking at a chart and you're visualizing a journey through that chart, just like staring at a stereogram and just seeing an image emerge in front of you, that to me is a ludic activity, which is not formalized like ludic activity, but it is a ludic activity. And I can see how gyan chaupar might be an attempt to formalize that activity and make a game out of it. And then, you know, at one point, this just flipped completely, and the whole meaning, the whole religious underpinning just disappeared, and you're just left with this abstract game, which, you know, children will play, not having the faintest idea of what it once meant. And it's fine both ways. And that's the beauty of it, I think.
Any more questions?
No, ma'am.
So
We have a comment by Sophie, ma'am.
Yeah,
Terrific talk and unusual snakes and ladder boards never ever seen. Needs to be watched again and heard again. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Sophie.
So thank you, Dr. Jacob, for coming here and giving this fantastic talk for our audience. all our Indian audience. Thank you very much. We would love to hear more from you on the same platform. And I'm sure our participants also will be saying the same. As Sophie Ma'am has said, that needs to be watched and heard again. So waiting for some more presentations from you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Good night.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.